Hi everyone. So this video is for Mercury in Pisces, and this is going to be looking at your natal Mercury placement if it happens to be in Pisces. If you just wandered onto this video and you don't know where your Mercury is, if your sun is in Pisces, there's a very good chance that your Mercury is going to be in Pisces. It can't be too far from the sun. It can only be in the sign that the sun is in, the sign behind it, and the sign ahead of it. So the two adjacent signs in addition to the sun sign. So I am providing a link to a chart generator below this video, and you can go there and see for sure where your Mercury is in. Sometimes, if you happen to be born on a specific date, it will show that it changed signs, and what you simply have to do is just listen to both videos and see which one makes more sense for you. Chances are when a planet changes signs in the same day, it will be, at that 0 degree mark, so you might notice that you are having both of those traits, that it's is a little bit of both, So who knows? You can just listen and find out. But if you have your time of birth, you will be able to pinpoint it. That's what I meant to say. So anyway, Mercury is all about communication, how we speak to others, how we, deliver our words. And not everybody has the same delivery, obviously. It's also how we receive information. And for a water sign like Pisces, it's not going to be all about just listening, okay? Because obviously there are other ways to figure out the true intention of what somebody is saying. It can be their facial expression, it can be their tone of voice, and a Mercury in Pisces individual may tune in more to those kinds of things. And even something less tangible than that. It could be some kind of intuitive hit that a Mercury in Pisces person gets when they're speaking, or I should say listening to somebody else speak, that they can hear the words, but really the intention of those words is more where they're what they're receiving. So this is what we talk about when we talk about psychic abilities, where we're not just looking at the cold hard facts of a situation, but something or some things that kind of like are triggered within us that go beyond just the bare minimum information that is provided. And this is one of the reasons I think that somebody who calls himself a psychic, clairsentient, where they might use an object like a photograph and look at the person who they're reading for and kind of read between the lines. They're getting some kind of feel for this person through other means. And so the same thing applies when a Mercury in Pisces person is listening to somebody else, or even taking in information through reading, for instance, is that they're not necessarily in a linear mode, okay, where they are just in their rational mind. As a matter of fact, Mercury in Pisces is at its detriment, which means it's at its weakest position. Now, before you get bummed out by this, if you happen to be Mercury in Pisces, I just want you to know that when I was amassing this information by looking it up, and, I have memorized some of the attributes of different signs and different planets, or planets and signs is a better way of putting it. But I do look things up because I want to clarify it or double check and also to get more information than what I have personally retained. And so I want to give a shout out to Astro Codex, I think is the name of it. Let me make sure, because that's where I think this is a real go-to site. And they even have a chart generator too. So you can check up, you can use that if you want. I haven't ever used it before. But according to them, and I already knew this, Mercury is also in its detriment in Sagittarius, which happens to be my Mercury as well as my sun sign. So I'm in the same boat as you guys, I guess. And look, I'm communicating information. So don't assume that if Mercury is at its weakest point, that it means that you can't be skilled in communication. You can be. It just won't be in the classic way that Mercury is represented in this sense. And the way that they consider it in its detriment is that it opposes, and oppositions are hard angles, the sign that Mercury rules. So Mercury rules two signs. It rules Virgo, your opposite sign, and Gemini, the opposite sign of Sagittarius. So there you go. So Mercury is about the way that we think. I like to say your consciousness, even though that may not be totally accurate, because consciousness really is transcending just the logical mind. But I'm using it because I think it's a good way of kind of talking about like what people think about most often when they are having thoughts, okay? So in other words, when I say that I think somebody has a lower consciousness, I believe that their thoughts are mainly geared towards certain base topics rather than a higher consciousness that is more devoted to higher minded things. And I'm not going to get into what I think those things are, because those may be just my opinion, but I sometimes will use that kind of those labels. Now, Pisces can, run the gamut just like any sign of whether they are lower consciousness or higher consciousness. But the one thing we can say about Mercury and Pisces is that it's not logical. It's actually, we would kind of put it more in the illogical category if we are looking at Mercury as being about the rational mind, the logical mind. That's a worldly construct, okay? That is not necessarily the end-all, be-all of our mind's goals and powers. So this is why all of these labels are relative, okay? And therefore should not be taken to heart, like saying it's in its detriment. That's relative, okay? So it doesn't, it doesn't mean that it's everything about the functioning of the mind. Because actually, if you think about it, if we talk about somebody who has psychic abilities, that will be connected to the mind, because in the mind's eye, a psychic could get these sense impressions, or I would call them, let's call them psychic impressions, that come in the form of visions, or even like hearing a clairaudient person may hear voices and things like that. So this is on a more of the spiritual plane, but it's coming through mentally, and therefore the person can speak on it. So anyway, having said all of that, a person with Mercury in Pisces is not going to necessarily communicate in a linear fashion. And if you have a child who has Mercury in Pisces, it's very important for a parent not to condemn the child and force them to, think in a way that is more, I'm looking for a word besides linear, since I keep saying it, but more, for lack of a better word, organized. Okay, so a person with Mercury in Pisces, because Pisces is ruled by Neptune and Neptune has no boundaries, can really get lost in daydreams. Okay, even adults, but a child, you may have a child with Mercury in Pisces, and the teacher writes a note or during the conferences and says, your child is always out in the ether, and I always have to kind of bring them back. And as somebody who experienced the same thing, I think of that line of John Lennon when he said, you may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. Don't ever think that this is something that is bad. It's not bad. It's how you're wired, okay? And if you are artistic, if you are spiritual, and I think those two things are connected, don't apologize for it. And if you're somebody who feels frustrated by your distortion of information, then what you can do is make sure that you become more organized mentally. And you can do things like make lists. There may be people out there who are very on point when it comes to having an efficient mind, and they can just they can remember everything that they need to do. They can, have that storage bin in their mind where they can just go to things and just da-da-da-da-da. You may have trouble with that. I don't know. I don't know about memory. I didn't read about that. I think it can probably work both ways. I think that it's possible that the working memory, which is a temporary memory, when you take in information, may be poor in the sense that it may be difficult for a person with Mercury in Pisces. I'm speaking for myself with Mercury in Sagittarius, where when you're receiving information, you may, or even if you set down your keys, you may forget, you may be very absent-minded. However, you may store memories very well. So that's long-term memory. I do believe that the water signs tend to have good long-term memories. So it just may be that the working memory isn't all that. And you can still work on that by making lists. So if you have an idea, don't just assume that you're going to remember it. Have always keep a little notepad by you so that you can jot down ideas that are really good, perhaps making lists, taking notes if you need to remember something, so that you don't just rely on that you're going to remember it later. Because there is such a creativity with people like you, you're also an escapist. And this is because of that Neptunian connection with Pisces. So you may love to read, for instance, which is a mental, intellectual activity. And I would say that even more so than, watching a movie or something like that. When you read, you have to really engage your mind much more. And this can especially mean that you are drawn to fantasy. And so I was thinking of King Arthur or, some kind of alternate universe. And I was even wondering if science fiction is a big draw. And I would say, especially if your sun sign is in Aquarius and you have the Mercury in Pisces, that this would be the case, because I associate Aquarius with science. So that combination of fantasy and science would definitely be appealing to somebody like that. And let's talk about just briefly how the different sun signs mesh with having a Mercury in Pisces. If your sun sign is also in Pisces, then you are the true sensitive soul who is the true poet. for sure. I mean, anybody who has Mercury in Pisces can be an amazing writer, a poet, even like songwriter. I'd like to know what Mercury James Taylor has, because I know his sun is in Pisces, but I don't know if his Mercury is in Pisces. I would imagine so, but you never know. But that kind of singer-songwriter, that soulful type of person, for sure, with the communication, that's going to be enhanced when your sun sign is in Pisces. Now, I want to say something before I continue, that when we talk about communication styles, I have been blown away, because this is only the second video that I'm producing with Mercury, that I have so much to say about Mercury. I kind of put this video off because I thought, it's not very sexy. It's not like, the moon sign or the sun sign. But actually, I'm just yammering on and on about this. And what I want to say is that in terms of communication, I realize now that communication is super important, because let's say you're upset about something in a relationship. If your sun sign is in Mercury and if your sun sign is in Pisces and your Mercury is in Pisces, that can indicate that when you're trying to deal with a problem in your personal relationship, whether it's a friendship or a love, a romantic relationship, you may have a very hard time being straight with somebody. You may be very indirect. You may try to hint at the issue. You may be afraid to hurt their feelings, even though you're hurting. So there is extreme sensitivity in communication when the sun and Mercury is in Pisces. If your sun sign is in Aries and you have Mercury in Pisces, this is going to be actually very helpful for kind of softening that bluntness of speech that an Aries person is known for rather infamously. So it can be a good thing. However, it can also lead to perhaps the tendency to be reluctant to say something when you are experiencing some sort of negative emotion with somebody. And then who knows? And of course, the moon would play into this as well. Maybe you don't say anything right away, and then you end up blowing up because you get so irascible, irritable about it. And the spontaneity of Aries finally gets the best of you. But I think it can make an Aries person much more compassionate, and so that they really are emotionally, empathic as they are communicating. For the other sign, in the other direction, Aquarius, this can really enhance the intuitive abilities that Aquarius naturally possesses, and also make a person who has a scientific mind, which, I shouldn't say mind, nature, okay, with the sun sign or interests in that direction, make them much more willing to consider the spiritual part of life. I think Charles Darwin had a sun sign in Aquarius. Now, I don't know what his Mercury sign was in. Maybe I should have known that before I opened my mouth. But he was an atheist, wasn't he? So an Aquarius person can be an atheist. Maybe his Mercury is in Capricorn. And he's like, hey, if I can't see it in the three-dimensional world, because Capricorn is an earth sign, then it doesn't exist, okay? So I could see somebody like that being very cynical or skeptical about spiritual matters. But if the Mercury is in Pisces, the person has a much more intuitive nature, and they're going to be more receptive to it. And they're also going to be more sensitive. Aquarius has a reputation of being very detached and sometimes not feeling. And so this will make them more feeling and more caring in that classic sense of the word. And also will make the person less on that abstract level intellectually. So here's another weird example that I can't verify the Mercury in. If anybody knows who David Foster Wallace is, and he's a novelist, he's no longer with us, but he was somebody who had a son that was, I think, technically in Pisces, but it really was on that cusp. And he was somebody, like, I never got into his writing because it was a weird, very, very scientific, but then he wrote novels, It was just, I'm sure some of you know exactly where I'm going with that. And this would make the person more poetic to have Mercury in Pisces. Now, if he had Mercury in Pisces, then there goes my theory, right? But I'm going to go out on a limb and say that his Mercury might have been in Aquarius. And then maybe his sun was at 0 degrees of Pisces. But anyway, so this makes for a softer Aquarian in many ways, in how they perceive life, because I think that Mercury can be your perception of your reality in a lot of ways, and some people really cling to the logical. Some people don't care if life is logical. I think Mercury in Pisces is a club of people who don't care about logic, So, yeah, so one thing to be careful about is watch out for people who are very manipulative, who try to get inside of your head, because you're very impressionable as mutable water for this Mercury position. Now, you are intuitive, and that means that you can read into things, but you ever notice how psychics sometimes cannot manage their own affairs? This is one of the main reasons, because the mind is so impressionable to influence that it questions its own perceptions, even when they're valid. So you may always get these psychic hits, but you're not sure if they are valid, and you kind of get lost in that fantasy. It is good to question your psychic impressions. Don't just assume that they're coming from this place that is beneficial to you. Do you ever hear somebody who is a holy roller or a psychic? And when I say a holy roller, like, I don't want to name names. So let's just say the 700 Club, and they say, I see this, I see that, and it just so happens to dovetail with their own desires, or psychic or something. And it seems very subjective, in other words. So Mercury in Pisces is very subjective because water is subjective. It's going to be very personal to you. It's not going to be objective like Mercury in Aquarius, which is more, that's what the scientific mind is supposed to be. Now, if a scientist happens to have the sun in Pisces and the moon in Aquarius, some of that subjectivity of the sun sign may seep into their so-called mental constructs. So it's always going to be kind of an interplay between all of these influences. And so watch out for anybody trying to indoctrinate you, brainwash you into a certain way of thinking, including cults. Because, of course, Mercury in Pisces is going to be interested in anything religious or spiritual. But if you meet the wrong person, you could be adversely influenced by them. And find your voice and don't be afraid to speak. Pisces is a passive sign, and so it tends to hesitate to speak. And you know what? We all have the right to our opinions. We all have the right to our beliefs. Don't allow somebody with a stronger, when I say stronger, more on the outer level, stronger sign to overpower you and try to get you to conform to their beliefs. You have the right to your own feelings and ideas. Okay, that's what I have for you. I hope you enjoyed this. And if you'd like a private reading, the link is below. Take care. Bye.